So in this video, I have a controversial theory that I want to get out into the ether. And I've shared this theory a couple times in private conversations, and the feedback I got from those who heard what I had to say was basically a head nod. And again, it's extremely controversial, but um, I think it makes a lot of logical sense. But before I get to it, I need to sort of set up why I think the way that I think. And so I hope you'll stick around and hear me out on this. So let me start here. Matthew 6:24. Jesus says, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Um, this is the starting point for me for trying to get across the way that I view the world, because the I want to start by saying this. The trick of the devil is to convince you that you can be a master. That's the trick. That's the Faustian deal, is you think you can become master. This was the trick in the garden. You can be like God. That was the temptation. It wasn't a fruit. It was, you eat this and you can become like God. That was what enticed them. That's what entices all of us. I've done videos before sort of explaining this. Um, this is important to understand because we live in a world in which, in American politics, right, we have this two-party political system. On the one hand, it is extremely useful to those in power to keep us divided and bickering among ourselves as they continue to pillage and abuse us. But on the other hand, it can be a way, and what I mean by this is the polarity, not the party system, but the idea of splitting things into left and right can be very uh, helpful in understanding the world, because the world can be extremely difficult. It's filled with gray areas and nuance, and I'm not minimizing that. I'm saying that if you can split everything and put it in left and right, a plus or a positives and negatives list, it can be helpful to be able to get through and chart a logic course to make sense of what's going on. Okay. Um, because of that, you when you start to do that, you can then make judgments and say, okay, left and right, I choose left, and then that puts you on the next step and the next step. Eventually, you get a logic uh, course. If you go A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, right? I mean, it's just how logic works. Um, and that's what I want to do. I want to use this polarity, this partisanship, this way of understanding left and right dynamics, and chart a way through to give you what I think's going on in the world. Um, remember when Trump was in office, one of the negative aspects that the media threw at you and said was terrible was how he was a nationalist. Um, even in the church, there's this negative view that's called Christian nationalism. Like this, the idea that being a nationalist is a pejorative. It's a negative. It's a bad thing to be a nationalist, okay? And the reason that is talked about is there's a couple reasons. For one, the Democrats, the left, like to think of themselves as global or present themselves as global humanitarians. And juxtaposition is that those on the right are closed-minded, border, Trump wants to build a wall. He's so closed-minded, he hates people outside the wall. That's the way that the politics gets spun. Okay. Obama, just to give you the difference, is that Obama was considered a more multicultural president. I mean, he lived a great deal of his life in Indonesia, was raised there for an early part of his life, and it was said to be born in Hawaii. So even, okay, that's the States, but Hawaii has its own cultural identity. A lot of native Hawaiians don't even, they think of themselves as Hawaiian first. And that's not a negative thing. I mean, I kind of understand that. They're Hawaiian. But in that, and that's a good point to sort of explain, is it really a negative to go, I'm an American? Is it okay to be America first? Is that okay? But I'm not even making a judgment at this point. I'm just setting up the idea that the left thinks in global terms and the right, as defined by Trump, thinks in nationalistic terms. Forget if it's good or bad. I'm just saying, I think that's a fair, it's a non-controversial way to explain the perspectives. Let's go to the next step. The next step is this. Everybody, no matter what side you're on of the political aisle, says that lobbyists are a bad thing, right? So, if I say a 1% corporation, the 1% of the 1%, spends money buying influence in our government, I think that is a known thing, and I think a lot of voters on both the right and the left find that to be a problem. Okay? But here's something that I want to explain when you combine the two things. This dynamic of tension between globalist versus nationalist. And understand that what that means is it's taken for granted that our country has a relationship with other countries, that it's a necessity in however the agenda is laid out will differ from politics to person, political party to political party. But understand that the United States is not in a vacuum. We are in a world, and we have to deal with these other countries. And it's also a given that our politicians are for sale. So I want you to focus in on this. We're in a world, our country is influencing other countries, and our other countries are influencing our country. And our politicians are for sale. I want to drive that home. Our country is influenced by other countries, and our politicians are for sale. Because what happens is that when we think about lobbyists, we only think about it domestically. Oh, the evil Enron type corporation wants to abuse the world, and it's going to spend their money and buy influence and destroy the world. That's a narrative that is thrown out there. But it isn't just this country, guys. We have a whole world, a whole bunch of global corporations, global interests, other nations that wouldn't mind currying a little favor with our elected representatives. Okay? Now, I couldn't understand. Let me see. How do I want to start this? Let's take Afghanistan. What we all witnessed in Afghanistan. Okay? Sometimes the story we're told has the truth in it without focusing on the truth. Biden will come to the podium and he will say things like, they told me to tell you, or they told me I need to not say, or I have a list that they've given me and I need to tell. Who's telling him these things, right? Everyone sees what's going on with Biden. Unless he's faking it, he seems to be experiencing dementia or Alzheimer's or some cognitive problem. Now, he's been experiencing this before he was elected. This is not a new phenomenon we've discovered after he became the president of this country. In Afghanistan, everybody's focusing on how this is something Biden did. That narrative is wrong. Biden isn't doing anything. I don't think Biden is in control. Biden has been placed there. Biden, let's talk about Biden for a minute. Well, now let's go back to Afghanistan. Afghanistan, we left our embassy in a way reminiscent of, 1969 Vietnam? Russia and China have embassies still in Afghanistan. Notice there was no emergency. There's not even fight. Is there fighting? Is the Taliban even going after Russia and China? So quick we left, by the way. We left an unbelievable amount, an ungodly amount of weaponry that is used to murder people. And Russia and China are still there. So let's leave that there. I'll leave that there. And then let's go back to Biden. So again, Biden is not in full control of his own faculties. He's not in control of the government. He didn't even run his campaign, really, right? I mean, I don't mean the standard thing, like everybody's got campaign managers and this sort of thing. I mean, this election was historic. I'm going to use the Google YouTube approved language. This was an historic election, guys. Historic. In that the guy who won didn't leave his basement very often, couldn't draw crowds, and yet had, what, 81 million votes counted? Another historic thing that happened is that somehow, and this was just obviously a coincidence, that over multiple time zones in specific counties, they stopped counting and discovered statistically improbable amounts of votes for a certain candidate. Go back to what I was saying about this idea that Russia and China are still in Afghanistan. There is no emergency in Afghanistan for Russia and China. And Biden isn't in control of this situation. You know, you could say that's a given, but what I mean by that is Biden doesn't even control his own press conferences. He's not the one calling the shots in Afghanistan. And based on the way that the election transpired, in the historic fashion in which it did, it leads to some, if A equals B and B equals C and A equals C sort of conclusions, right? Again, remember, we live in a world that is not border, that, you know, we can cross borders, right? Guess what crosses borders? Money crosses borders. Money crosses borders. And influence. Money is used to influence. And other places other than the United States have influence and access to our representatives. And Joe Biden, you know, this isn't a political statement, really. See, because Joe Biden really wasn't a big Democrat, how do I say this? He wasn't, Joe Biden has run for president multiple times. And he's never gotten really far until now. It's just very interesting. Interesting things happened in the primary. Even when Joe Biden had his cognitive ability, he didn't have enough cognitive ability when he was younger and better to do his own speeches. He plagiarized. He admitted it. I mean, this is just a known fact. And, you know, he does have a son that has some ties to a certain country that I've mentioned. And it's just interesting chain of coincidences that take place. In regards to the world and how the world works, you can see in the physical parallels to the spiritual. So when Jesus says, you can't serve two masters, and I said, the trick is that you think you can be your own master. I want you to know that that is what we end up trying to think that we can do, but ultimately we're going to fall under a master. You will be in God's kingdom under that dominion or in the dominion of the world. And what I mean by that is under it, we're influenced by both, right? I don't care if you're an atheist, you're influenced by the kingdom of God. If you're a Christian, you're influenced by this world. And at some point, you have an allegiance. You have to profess an allegiance. And what I would ask people is to understand that this world is making demands and setting things in order. And there's powers and principalities, Paul says. It's like countries, and they have influence over other situations going on. So the question that we have to ask ourselves, you may think that your president is so-and-so. But just like you may think you can be your own master, but the world has something different in store for you. You think this guy is in charge, but the world is saying to us somebody else is actually in charge. The question that I have for you is, can you spot who your master is? And just on a personal level, who is your master?